Darkcast Network. Indie pods with a dark side. Hello and welcome back to Fuck That. Today I have an episode that is sure to send chills down your spine as we explore the dark corridors of hospitals and healthcare institutions. When we think of hospitals, we think of these as places where people go to seek high-quality, competent medical care, and ultimately a place where we go to get better. But sometimes these institutions become scenes of unimaginable crimes perpetrated by those who we have inherently learned to trust. Joining me today is Bruce Sackman, a special agent who made it his life's mission to unmask medical professionals turned criminals. Bruce is the subject and co-author of the book Behind the Murder Curtain, and Bruce's work has led to the arrest and prosecution of several healthcare providers, including doctors and nurses who were convicted of crimes ranging from fraud to multiple counts of murder. Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Can you briefly describe your journey into becoming a special agent focused on healthcare crimes?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I guess growing up, maybe I was watching too many true crime stories. I was particularly a fan of Lieutenant Columbo. So when I graduated college, I said, this is really something that I would like to do. And I began as an investigator for the Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of Defense, doing background investigations on applicants for top secret security clearances, and then eventually doing fraud cases for the government. A couple of years into that, a new president by the name of Jimmy Carter came into office. And one of the good things that he did is he established an office of Inspector General in the various federal agencies. So like the Defense Department, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Interior. They all now had inspector generals. And the purpose of the inspector general is to ferret out fraud, waste, and abuse in that particular agency. And that usually means investigating white-collar crimes and sometimes theft. But after my career with the Defense Department, I was fortunate enough to join the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, which is the VA. And eventually I rose to the position of special agent in charge of the Northeast Field Office for the VA. And what that rather long title meant is that I was responsible for all major criminal investigations involving the VA, including the hospital system and the outpatient clinics and regional offices from West Virginia to Maine. I had 5 officers that reported to me. In the hospital system, we had theft, of course, of hospital property. We had drug diversion, where nurses and doctors would steal drugs, sometimes for their own personal use, sometimes for the use of others, sometimes even for resale. We had a lot of bribery cases because if you're a contractor and if you could get into a hospital system that has maybe 7, 8, 10, 20 hospitals, well, that could change your life. So what would happen is some contractors would actually try to bribe some of our employees to get into the hospital system. And remember, in hospitals, we have research, we have radiation, we have medical records. That is very important that we safeguard. Hospitals are always under attack by hackers. So there's a whole host of crimes that could occur in medical centers. But what sort of changed my life is that one day I got a call from the chief of psychiatry at the VA hospital in Northport, Long Island. And she said, Bruce, you're not going to believe this, but there's a doctor working here who actually spent time in prison for poisoning his coworkers. Now, I didn't think in the United States of America such a thing was possible, that you could actually be convicted of the felony of poisoning people and come out and be a doctor, but I was wrong. And that's what started me on this journey. That case involved a physician by the name of Dr. Michael Swango, who worked in various hospitals across the country and actually across the world, and wound up on my watch in my neighborhood on Long Island. And that's what started my journey into the world of medical serial killers. After Swango, I got involved in other cases and then in cases around the world. So that's how it all began for me.
It is really interesting to consider the fact that somebody is allowed to practice as a clinician in any capacity if they have a history of poisoning.
Well, I'm very glad that you mentioned that, because one of the commonalities among all the medical serial killers around the world are the number of hospitals that they've worked in until they're finally caught and prosecuted. And there are numerous cases like this. One of the most famous cases in the United States is actually the case of Charles Cullen. If you've seen the show called The Good Nurse or read the book, Charles Cullen began his career in Pennsylvania and ended up in New Jersey. And when hospital number one suspected something, they never said anything to hospital two because they were just so glad that he moved on, who never said anything to hospital three, hospital four, hospital five, hospital six, hospital seven, hospital eight, hospital nine, and finally hospital 10. And a number of these hospitals had done a pretty good internal investigation and came to the conclusion that there was a high probability that he was murdering his patients. But none of them called the police. None of them had mentioned to the next hospital what their suspicions were. And this is why medical serial killers kill so many people until they get caught. You know, your traditional serial killer, maybe 7 or 8 people. Well, they're actually amateurs compared to my medical serial killer. Many of them have killed 30, 60, over 100 patients. And one of the reasons is that hospital management will cover up and just be so happy when this employee moves on to the next hospital that they don't want to call the police. They don't want to bring bad publicity to the hospital or to themselves. And this enables my medical serial killers to keep on killing.
Yeah, I believe it. I feel like especially now, I wonder as we see a shift towards these larger healthcare organizations where one health network is purchasing every hospital in the area, I wonder if we'll almost see this happening more frequently just because you have funding coming from not having infections, not having people die. Publicity plays a big role on being able to acquire a hospital compared to maybe a competitor in a health network. So I almost wonder if that will make this situation worse or if it almost kind of opens up the possibility to see this even more.
Well, I certainly hope it doesn't make it worse, but I could tell you this, in my opinion, until some senior level managers who aided and abetted these murderers are held responsible criminally, this is going to continue. Because you see this with whether it be the pharmaceutical companies or the hospitals, where hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, if you look at the oxycodone case, have died, and no senior leader has been charged criminally anywhere in the world. So the financial incentive to whether it be a hospital director or a pharmacy director or the owner of a large pharmaceutical firm is to lie and do everything they can to protect the reputation of the hospital. Because even if they do get caught, well, then the business will be fined and the business will have to pay the money, but they themselves will probably remain exactly where they are, untouched either financially or even administratively. And until we change that, these cases are going to continue. Until a manager thinks that he's going to go to jail himself for aiding and abetting these medical serial killers, we're going to continue to have medical serial killers.
Yeah, I agree. I think especially since healthcare is very much for profit now, if these higher level management are just profiting and they don't see any way that there's going to be any repercussions and that their jobs are going to remain safe, really, what is the incentive other than just having a moral compass to report these crimes?
Well, there is no incentive. In fact, how did we find out about these crimes? How did I find out about all these crimes that I've investigated? Well, I can tell you for the most part, it's through the brave whistleblowers, those honest nurses and doctors who went to management and were extremely frustrated and wound up calling my office and saying, we went to management with this. They told us essentially to go back our office and keep our mouth shut, but we're not going to do that. So we've called you. It's very rare that I ever got a call from senior management that may have suspected a particular employee was murdering their patient. Because a whistleblower will go to their manager and say, hey, boss, every time this Nurse Bruce is on duty, the death rate goes up. Nurse Bruce takes a week off, the death rate goes down. Now, that doesn't mean that Nurse Bruce is a serial killer. But you know something interesting? See, these patients were not expected to expire when they did. As a matter of fact, many of them were actually improving until they got a visit from Nurse Bruce, to which management will say, well, you know what? Maybe Nurse Bruce has the most complex cases, and that's why these people were dying. Did you actually see Nurse Bruce kill anybody? Well, I haven't actually seen him kill anybody. Oh, I see. So this is just something you kind of suspect. Is that it? Well, I want to ask you a couple of questions there, Miss Nurse Whistleblower. Is all your education up to snuff? Is there anything in your background that could be brought up against you? The reason why I ask you this, and this is for your own protection, is that when you start making allegations, well, you're kind of under investigation yourself. I mean, if we drug tested you right now, nurse, are you going to be positive? Are we going to find something maybe we shouldn't have? So, when you bring these allegations forward, you got to make sure there, nurse, that you're doing your job and you're pretty good yourself, because things are going to come out. Are you prepared for that if you want that? And you know what happens if the word gets out in this hospital that somebody is intentionally killing them? Tell you what happened. There was a hospital years ago in New Jersey where one doctor was killing the patients of another doctor just to eliminate the competition. Well, the case went to trial and everybody in the community knew about it. And the hospital had to change its name 3 times and they still went out of business. Do you want to lose your job? Do you want me to lose my job? I think if it's better, you just kind of let this go. And hopefully, this Nurse Bruce will move on to another hospital and it won't be our problem anymore. And this is a very, very common response throughout the world.
And I feel like that uneven power dynamic still exists very much in healthcare today between doctors and nurses. So you have a nurse that might see something that is suspicious, but you could very much have, and I could see how this would play out, a doctor insinuating, well, do you want us to lose our jobs? How do you know this is what you saw? I'm the doctor. That could become problematic for a nurse or even maybe a PCT or a respiratory therapist that sees something to be intimidated and scared and backed into a corner.
Well, you know what? Ask yourself this question. If you're so inclined to commit a series of murders, what profession and what location might you choose? First of all, you probably want to choose a profession that has the power of life and death over someone. And what professions do we know have that power? You might want to choose a profession where you take an oath to save lives. Because you know what? If you want to kill people, and if you join an outlaw motorcycle gang or organized crime, that's not hiding. But if you go into a hospital where people have dedicated their lives to saving people, where you have the most honest, compassionate people on the planet, who's going to suspect that someone who has taken an oath to save lives is actually intent on taking lives? How about working in a profession where the victim and the family trust you implicitly? How about working in a place where there's a real shortage of nurses or professionals? There are some parts of the country, we have to go all the way to the Philippines to find nurses, or Ireland. If we didn't do such a great background investigation on this employee, well, excuse me, we're lucky we even found somebody to work here. How about working in a place where death is a common everyday occurrence. If somebody dies in a hospital or a nursing home, is that going to bring in the police? Well, of course not. Death is a common everyday occurrence. How about working in a place where you work alone at night? If you've ever been on a hospital ward, let's say 5 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, there's not that much activity going on. Maybe there's a nurse and a nurse's aide. So what's to stop me from taking that curtain and putting that curtain behind me and the patient and doing whatever I want to do without anybody seeing exactly what I'm doing? Now, how about working in a place that the police are unfamiliar with? In fact, the police don't even want to go into hospitals. Why? A number of reasons. Most cops don't become cops because they're good in chemistry and biology. So we're very easily intimidated by the science, and we're intimidated by the law. I mean, what is this HIPAA law that we hear about, this Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act? What the hell is that? What documents can I get? What documents can I get? Do I need a court order? Do I need a judge to sign it? Can I get everything? I mean, I'm so confused by this. Where are all the records? How many departments are there? Who do I speak to? Who do I believe? You know what? We have so many other cases out there. Really rather not work in the hospital. What happens if the victim cries out, "Hey, that nurse is trying to kill me"? Oh, we don't pay any attention to that in the hospital. We hear that all the time. In fact, if the patients continue to say that, we're just going to make a little note in their chart saying that they're obviously suffering from the effects of the numerous medication they are, and they're hallucinating. And there's a real condition. It's called the hospital delirium. So if I think that this nurse is trying to kill me, nobody's going to believe it. The hospital itself supplies all the death-dealing chemicals you would ever need, right, particularly on the crash cart, some of which are untraceable even with today's modern toxicology. The overwhelming majority of healthcare professionals are the most honest, hardworking, dedicated, compassionate people I have ever met. But because of that, this is what enables the killers to be so successful, because they live in an environment of people that are as wonderful as these people.
Absolutely. I know that when you're talking about readily available medications, I'm going to assume that succinylcholine is probably at the top of the list. But before we get into that, I want to ask you if you can walk us through your investigative process when you suspect a healthcare professional is involved in illegal activities. And to piggyback off that, based on what you had just said, have you noticed in your investigations any correlations between the individuals you investigated, obviously outside of them being clinicians? I'm curious if maybe they had similarities in personality traits or backgrounds, or if there's anything outside of them working in healthcare that you noticed correlated to one another.
Yeah, those are two really big and very, very important questions. Maybe I'll take the second question first. In my experience, now look, I'm not a psychiatrist, a psychologist. I don't have a PhD or anything even remotely close to it, but I can tell you what I've seen. The overwhelming majority of medical serial killers, not all though, because it's not like one size fits all, but the overwhelming majority of them, I find, suffer from something called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Munchausen syndrome is when an individual will intentionally harm themselves and go into a hospital because they're seeking care and attention, something they don't get at home. In the VA, we actually had this fellow. We dubbed his name Major Munchausen. He would start on the West Coast and wound up on the East Coast. And he would study the particular ailments that our researchers were researching in a various hospital, and he would know what all the symptoms are. He would go into the hospital claiming that he had all these symptoms, and the researchers would go, "Eureka, I found the patient that I've always been looking for." And then in short order, they realized the guy was fraud, and he'd move on to the next hospital. And that was Major Munchausen. Now, Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is also known as factitious disorder. This is an example of this is when a mother might intentionally harm a child, bring that child into hospital because The mother is looking for attention and recognition that she's not really getting at home. And the reason why I say this is so common, let me give you a number of examples of this happening. The first example, which is in my book, is the case of Kristen Gilbert. Kristen Gilbert would intentionally put people into codes. And when I say a code, it's a cardiac arrest, and it's a very exciting event. And the crash cart would come, and everybody would run in, and she would take charge. And even the physicians who worked there said, if I ever coded, I would want Kristen Gilbert to be there. She takes charge. She starts barking orders to the young interns who were scared out of their mind. And when you look at her evaluation, you would see that she's an okay nurse, except when it came to codes. And that's where she was really outstanding. Go across the pond to Germany for a fellow named Niles Hogel. Killed over 100 patients. You find the same thing. This even by his own admission, that he intentionally put people into codes because that gave him an opportunity to shine. It was all about attention to him. The most recent case in England, Lucy Letby. Very similar to Kristen Gilbert. In fact, they almost look alike. When Kristen Gilbert would have a code, her boyfriend, who happened to be a VA police officer, would respond to the code as well. This gave her an opportunity to show off to her boyfriend. In England, the case of Lucy Letby, the nurse who murdered babies, her physician boyfriend would show up and the same thing would happen. So I have seen many examples of this Munchausen syndrome throughout the world. And I would personally rate that number one. And maybe some psychiatrists, psychologists might differ with me, but that's my experience after doing these cases for over 20 years. The next reason I find is just some people crave that power of life and death over someone. And that was the case of Michael Swango out on Long Island. He wasn't into codes. He was into killing people because he enjoyed having the power of life and death over someone. And it is an incredible power. There was once a medical serial killer named Donald Harvey. He killed people at the VA and outside of the VA. And they asked him, they said, why did you kill people? And he said, well, after I murdered the first 15 and no one even questioned me, so thought I was ordained by the Almighty to do this. Maybe that's not so irrational if you kill 15 people and nobody even questions what the heck you're doing. So he craved that power of life and death over someone. And then on rarer occasions, you have those patients that keep ringing the buzzer. And there was a case in Italy, Danielle Pagliotti, who said, I'll take care of them, those people who keep ringing the buzzer. And she took care of them all right in her own way. And she actually took a selfie of herself and the deceased patient. And then I would say on rather rare instances, there are just medical professionals, and this is a case in Texas ongoing right now as we speak like this, who are generally pissed off at the management. Hey, you know what? I'm the best doctor in this hospital. And you know what they did to me? They took away my privileges. They took away my patients. Well, I'll show them what happens when I'm not a doctor here anymore. And he started tampering the medication for other patients and allegedly, because the case is still ongoing, killing other patients. So those are the reasons that I have found in my own humble experience. That's what I have found the reason why medical professionals commit the murder that they do. So now what happens when a case like this comes to the light? And it comes to light like this. Almost every case in the world comes to light like this. Every time Nurse Bruce is on duty, the death rate goes up. Every time Nurse Bruce takes a week or two off, the death rate goes down. The patients were not expected to expire when they did, and we suspect some. Management will poo-poo this, and eventually the allegation would come to me. Now, the first time I had one of these cases, I had never run a homicide case before in my life. I had every other crime imaginable in a hospital, but I never had an allegation of a doctor and nurse intentionally murdering patients. I mean, look, doctors and nurses kill patients all the time, but it's not intentional. There are accidents, malpractice, infections, all kinds of things. But I'm talking intentional murder. So what my boss did, he said, don't worry about it, Bruce. We're going to hook you up with somebody. And that's when I met Dr. Michael Baden. Many of you probably heard of him. He's always on TV. He's authored many books. He had a television show called Autopsy. And he is a forensic pathologist. And I visited him and I said, Doc, I had never done one of these cases before. Can you guide me? And he said, don't worry, Bruce, I will teach you. And learning this, well, it was like learning physics from Albert Einstein. You really couldn't get much of a better teacher. And he said, this is the first thing we're going to do. And this was in the case of Michael Swango out on Long Island. He said, we're going to gather up all the records of all the patients that were at the Northport VA during the time that Michael Swango was there. Then what we're going to do is we're going to assemble a team. And this is what this team will consist of. Himself as the pathologist, my office and my agents as the investigators. And we're going to also have an expert. We're going to find an expert, a physician who's an expert on chart reviews. And he could review the charts of these patients and make a determination, in his opinion, whether these patients had expired from their natural disease causes or there was really no reason why they should have expired when they did. There was no logical explanation. The next group we're going to add to this, at that time, was a relatively new group of people known as forensic nurses. And these are nurses that are trained both in forensic science and nursing science. And they were phenomenal because they were able to bridge the gap between lay people like myself and the high-level medical professionals who would speak a language I may not even understand. And the last thing we have to do is get a tox lab, a lab that has the expertise to find poisons in embalmed tissues. So we have this team, and we narrowed it down to about 6 really good cases out at the Northport VA Medical Center. We have to go to the cemeteries and exhume the bodies. One will get a court order to do it. And the second thing is you and your agents have to go to the families, ring their doorbells and say something like this. Good evening. My name is Bruce Sackman. I'm a special agent with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of Inspector General. We have reason to believe that your dad's death was of a suspicious nature. Can we have your permission to exhume their body at the cemetery and run tests? Could you imagine getting a visit like that? Well, I could tell you the families were fantastic. Some of the families actually wanted to be there to witness the exhumation. Others did not. And then I found myself in a cemetery with a backhoe, digging up the gravesite, pulling the coffin out of the ground, taking the coffin to the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's office, where Dr. Baden, along with the Suffolk County Medical Examiner at the time, Dr. Charles Wetley, took the bodies apart and looked at them. And Michael Baden, I remember one instance, Michael Baden shows me a heart and he says, you see, Bruce, the death certificate says he died of heart disease. This patient didn't die of heart disease. There's nothing wrong with this heart here. There was some other cause of death, probably some kind of externally administered poison. Well, how are we going to find that out? Well, we have to find a lab, and we asked the FBI lab. They weren't interested in doing the case, so we had to go to a private lab, a firm called National Medical Services. And I remember speaking to the president of the lab, Dr. Reeders, and I said, could you find possibly any poisons in these embalmed tissues? And Dr. Reeders said, yes, we can. We have this brand new machine. It's called the High Performance Liquid Chromatography Tandem Mass Spectrometer. Give us time, and we will come back, and we will tell you what's in that body that shouldn't be in the body. And they came back in these cases, and they said, there's one of 2 drugs in these people that shouldn't be in there according to their own medical records. The first drug is the one you mentioned, succinylcholine. In the hospital, they call it Sux. It's actually a paralytic. It's used to put a tube down your throat, and it temporarily paralyzes you. And the other drug is epinephrine. And there's no reason why there should be traces of epinephrine inside of these bodies. And that's how most of these cases wind up. They wind up with an exhumation. They wind up with numerous interviews. Not only interviews of employees and supervisors, as you would imagine, but sometimes even neighbors, prior coworkers. They're very, very involved case. They take years and a lot of money. And that's something many police departments don't have the time or the personnel or certainly the money to perform these kind of cases. But that's how most of them wind up being solved, many times over a period of years.
I'm curious, just piggybacking off of what you said with having Sux and epinephrine in their screenings and they weren't supposed to have them. Did you notice a correlation that a lot of the patients that had died at the hands of clinicians you investigated were perhaps not in MICU or patients that didn't need to be vented? Were these patients that were typically admitted for things that were a lot more mild and maybe not something that would require intensive care?
Well, it kind of varied. A number of the patients were in ICU. And something interesting, when I first looked at these medical records as a layperson, I said, my God, I didn't know you could have this much wrong with you and still be alive, let alone I have to prove they were murdered. So a number of these patients are in the ICU. Not all of them, but a number of them were. But a number of them, even though they were in the ICU, weren't expected to expire when they did. If you ever had a loved one that was very, very ill, maybe near death in a hospital, well, you kind of suspected that they would expire. And the staff expected that they would expire, so death was not shocking. But in these particular cases, many times, even in the ICU, the patients were actually improving, only for the families to get that phone call that their dad or mom had expired unexpectedly. Now, I'm not saying that we caught everyone. With Swango, about a month ago, I got a phone call from a family, and they said, hey, Bruce, I think you missed one with Swango. We think our dad was actually murdered by Swango, and they laid out their case, and it could be. It could be, what we do in all these cases, whether it be Swango, Gilbert, or anywhere in the world, is we have little choice but to pick and choose the best cases we can, the cases that we feel we could prove in court. But do we get them all? Absolutely not. We never do. And I feel sorry. I feel bad for the families that their dad was murdered. And I said to them, well, what do you want now? So many years later, with Swango been sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, I mean, he can't get more of a sentence. He said, well, we just want the VA to acknowledge that our dad was murdered at their hospital. I don't think that's going to happen. I certainly don't think that's going to happen, but I understand. So no, we don't get them all, but we should try our best.
Yeah, it's understandable that they at least want an acknowledgement for some form of closure, but that's an uphill battle for a healthcare organization, especially the VA, that is literally run by the government. For them to admit fault it's a tough challenge, but I understand why they would want that. Now, for those that are not familiar with Dr. Swango, do you mind giving them a synopsis?
Sure. Well, when Dr. Swango was in medical school, his fellow students referred to him as 00 Swango, licensed to kill. Because it seemed like when he was visiting patients, oddly enough, some of them expired unexpectedly. And he wasn't really documenting things properly and all. So the students went to the dean and they said, hey, Dean, we don't think this guy Michael Swango should be a physician. And the dean said, what do you know? You're only students. I'm the dean. Yeah, I think he should be a doctor. He just needs maybe some more training. So let's keep him like an extra 6 months here in medical school, and I'm sure he'll be fine. And that's exactly what happened. Then he winds up in Ohio State Medical Center, University Medical Center, which is an excellent hospital. And patients start dying unexpectedly. And this one patient, her name was Cynthia McGee. She was a gymnast in the university. And she got in a car accident hit by another student. And she was actually improving until she got a visit from Dr. Swango. And then she died unexpectedly. Well, Swango wasn't charged with that murder. The student that hit her with his car was charged with vehicular homicide. But he didn't kill Cynthia McGee. We learned later, of course, that it was Swango. Well, the hospital did the internal investigations, and they tried their best to prove that there was a case against Swango, but they couldn't. They didn't call in the police. So Swango leaves, and he becomes an EMT back home where he grew up, and he's doing a pretty good job. And then one day he invites his coworkers and he says, guys and girls, you guys are really great. Here's some donuts, on me, just to show my appreciation for all your hard work. That evening they go home, and many of them are extraordinarily ill after eating those donuts. And he calls each one of them up and he says, tell me your symptoms. Tell me everything that happened to you. You see, because this was his second time to get a thrill. The first time when he actually poisoned the donuts with arsenic. And the second time was hearing how the victims were suffering. Well, these EMTs are not stupid. And about 2 weeks later, Swango comes in with some iced tea. And he says, hey guys, you work so hard. Here's some iced tea I made for you. And I say, okay, Dr. Swango, just leave it there. We'll have it later. And after he leaves, they have it tested, and it's loaded with arsenic, and they call the police. And the police arrest Swango, and he winds up going to prison for 3 years for poisoning his coworkers. Now, like I said, I didn't think in the United States of America you could come out of prison after poisoning your coworkers and be a physician again, but boy, I was wrong, and that's exactly what happened. Swango, being a sociopath, could be the most charming guy on the face of the earth. And he convinced people through false documentation and other things that he actually spent time in prison because he got involved in a barroom brawl, but the governor of the state had restored his civil rights. And they say, great, come on. Next thing you know, he's a physician on the West Coast. He meets a nurse. They get engaged. Everything's fine until word got out that he spent time in prison for poisoning his coworkers. He loses his job. They separate. His fiancée goes back home on the East Coast, and she says, Mom and Dad, I really love this guy, Swango. But after I heard what happened, I couldn't stay with him anymore. But something funny? When I was living with him, I was getting these headaches. I feel better now. And then one day, the doorbell rings. It's Mr. Charming, and Swango gets back into her life, and things go downhill from there. And then eventually she said she can't take it anymore. She takes a gun, she goes to the park, and she blows her brains out. Well, you can't blame Swango for that, can you? Well, actually you can, because even though she shot herself, the body was cremated, but her family kept a lock of her hair, which we had tested. It was loaded with arsenic. Yeah, Swango was even murdering his own fiancée. Well, to make a long story short, that's when he winds up at the VA hospital in Northport, Long Island. And this is through a residency program he had with Stony Brook Medical Center, because Stony Brook Medical Center has a teaching arrangement with the Northport VA Medical Center. And in order to get this residency, which, by the way, was in psychiatry, he had to go in front of a board of trained psychiatrists and convince each and every one of them that he should be in the program, which he did. And that's how he wound up at the VA. And that's what began my investigation. And eventually, some years later, his criminal prosecution and sentence for 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole for murdering a number of our nation's heroes at the Northport VA Medical Center.
He was a general physician to begin with, right? It's interesting that he changed specialties.
Yes.
I'm sure that he did that for a reason, but that's very interesting that he chose to just switch to the complete other end of the spectrum to go from GP to psychiatry.
Yeah.
Now, can you talk to us about a case that was particularly difficult for you to solve? And if so, why?
Yeah. There's a case that remains unsolved to this day. I guess almost every investigator has one that sticks in their craw. This is the case of Richard Williams in a place called the Harry S. Truman Medical Center in Columbia, Missouri. This case began before I was even involved with medical serial killers, conducted by both the FBI and the VA Inspector General's office. And they were unable to show that Richard Williams had murdered patients, even though people were dying unexpectedly every time he was on, the whole 9 yards. Whistleblowers came forth. They even went in front of Congress. Both agencies, and not for lack of trying, could not prove that Richard Williams had actually murdered patients. Now, there was a civil suit. The family sued, and the judge said, yes, in my opinion, I think Richard Williams has murdered these patients. But the burden of proof in a civil case is a lot different than the burden of proof in a criminal case. Burden of proof in a civil case, if you think of the O.J. cases as an example, the burden of proof in a civil case is the preponderance of evidence, or 51% of the evidence. In a criminal case, it's a much higher bar. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. Everyone in the jury would have to agree that he murdered people. So after I completed the Nurse Kristen Gilbert case, I said to the Inspector General, I said, "You mind if I take a shot at the Richard Williams case?" And he was very, very supportive. He said, "No, knock yourself out." So we gathered up all the medical records regarding the Richard Williams case, sent them to New York, and had my wonderful team of forensic nurses, along with Dr. Baden, review these files. And they came to the conclusion that these patients were probably poisoned with succinylcholine. And then we went to the lab, the Reader's lab, and we asked the Reader's lab to make a determination. And they said, yes, we have found traces of succinylcholine in the embalmed tissue of these patients. And Richard Williams gets indicted for 13 counts of murder. And I couldn't have been happier. And then things went downhill from there. Because I get a phone call from the lab and they say, Bruce, I'm sorry. We made a mistake. We can't really prove that succinylcholine was used in these cases. And once the prosecutor, who was a state prosecutor, not a federal prosecutor, and I'll explain why in a minute. Once the prosecutor heard that, he decided to dismiss the indictment and withdraw all the charges. And that was his decision, not mine. I argued to continue the case to show that the deaths were consistent with succinylcholine poisoning, even though we didn't have the toxicology, but he declined. And the reason why it was a state case is because VA hospitals come in 3 different flavors. The first flavor is exclusive jurisdiction, and that's like Northport. That means only the federal government has prosecutorial jurisdiction. The second flavor is something called concurrent jurisdiction, where a hospital case could be tried either in the state or the federal government. That was the case with Kristen Gilbert. And the last flavor, which is the most rare of all the flavors, is proprietorial jurisdiction, where the state has exclusive prosecutorial authority. And that's what happened with the Richard Williams case. So the charges were dropped against Richard Williams, and then he left the VA and went to the private sector. He went to work at a nursing home. And guess what happened at the nursing home? Patients started to expire unexpectedly. No proof. He's never been charged again. Right now, he's cloaked under the presumption of innocence. I can only say he's an alleged medical serial killer. I always hope one day something else will happen, or that he'll have a come to Jesus moment, as they say, and give the family some closure. But it was a very unfortunate and painful experience for all concerned. But that's what this business is like. You win some, and there's some you don't win.
Yeah, that case stuck out to me after we spoke. I read about it, and I know that there were 10 people at least that he was being tried for. And I remember reading that they found sucks in the tissue of the people that had died under his care, but then they were like, well, in some controls, it may end up in their tissues during autopsy. And I just remember thinking, it just doesn't sound like a thorough rebuttal to that, especially if these patients don't need it. Like, I'm curious if these 10 patients where it was administered, what was the cause? What was the reason?
Yeah, you know what? The problem actually was the test itself. Because when the FBI lab tried to replicate the test, it wasn't successful. They actually found succinylcholine in places that they knew no succinylcholine existed. So the test was flawed. And of course, you have to show everything to the defense, which is only fair, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the prosecutor decided not to pursue the case. I was very unhappy. We all met at National Medical Services. We tried our best to convince the prosecutor. He declined, and that was his decision. And maybe it was the right decision. I really can't say for sure. I know my own feeling, but my feelings don't really count.
I mean, I'll say I think that it was the wrong decision, but that's just me. I'm not a prosecutor. But I think it's very telling that he made the conscious choice to then go to work in a nursing home where we all know there is much less oversight and it's much easier to get away with abuse against the people that are residing in nursing homes. So I think that is very telling of this person's intentions.
I think so, too.
What steps do you think that healthcare facilities can take to make it even more difficult for these crimes to occur?
I think there's a couple of things that need to be done. The first thing is educating the staff on these cases. In my book, I have my red flags, and I think the staffs need to be educated. Second thing is there has to be proper protection for whistleblowers. And there has to be an incentive for whistleblowers to come forth. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. There's something called a key tam lawsuit. This is what a key tam lawsuit is. If you're working for a hospital or a contractor and you're aware of any fraud against the government, you could go to an attorney and he could file a suit under seal. It's a whistleblower suit called a key tam lawsuit. And you could collect, as the relator of that lawsuit, up to 25% of all the money that the government recovers in fines and penalties. So if the XYZ hospital is ripping off Medicaid for $100 million, you could get 25% of whatever fines and penalties the government issues for that. It's a wonderful thing. It's a gift to investigators. It's a gift to society. But no such financial incentive exists for blowing the whistle on professionals who are intentionally harming their patients. So there's no incentive for attorneys to take these cases. There's no financial incentive for whistleblowers to come forth. In fact, the financial incentives are the other way. The financial incentives are really to keep your mouth shut. And there's certainly no financial incentives at all for management to report this. So until we change the whole incentive system and have something akin to key tam suits for employees who are able to show and eventually prove that a physician or a nurse is intentionally harming people, they're not going to come forward. And lastly, until we criminally prosecute managers, whether it be from nursing homes or hospitals, or senior managers who knowingly and willingly aid and abet these murders, this is going to continue. And that's my formula for changing the system.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Although I'm a little bit nervous with the fact that healthcare is so much for profit now. I'm curious, do you ever think that we'll see the day when upper level management is held culpable for things like this?
Well, I must say, the last hospital I worked in, I'll tell you a story. I'm not going to disclose where they were, but it's a very positive story. So an issue came up and there was an opportunity to actually cover it up, to not tell the patients what happened. And I was at the meeting and the dean stood up and he said, there will be no cover-ups here. We will tell the patients and we will report this to every authority we're supposed to report it. And boy, I tell you, that made my day. That was a wonderful thing, but not every hospital will follow that lead. As a matter of fact, have you read recently in the paper about the OBGYN in Columbia Presbyterian, Dr. Baden, Hadden, who sexually molested about 250 patients, including, remember the last presidential candidate, Andrew Yang? His wife was one of the victims. And they covered up and they fought law enforcement and they did everything they could to hide this from the public and hinder the police investigation. They wound up paying millions of dollars in fines and penalties and money to the families, but did anybody go to jail other than the doctor? Nope. Anybody, I don't even know if anybody got fired or terminated or anything that happened. I only know what I've read in the paper. But could you imagine that? Not uncommon. That is what is common. We have to change that and make it so it's extremely uncommon.
Yeah, that number is astounding to me. And that's something I feel like as women in healthcare, when we're making these appointments, we shouldn't have to consider, oh, do we feel safe with a male versus a female? We should just feel that security net regardless of whatever provider we see. So it's unfortunate that this person in that position of power was able to successfully, for lack of a better term, I hate to use that word, but take advantage of so many people. It's just alarming to think that, and that's probably not even the gist of it. I'm sure that there's probably way more.
Yeah. I think a lot of things have changed. And let me tell you what has changed. First of all, medical credentialing has improved dramatically. This is really as a result of the Swango case, because no hospital really wants a Dr. Swango working for them. So medical credentialing departments have increased their size dramatically, and they do a much, much better job now. Not perfect, because people still slip through the cracks, but a much, much better job hiring and vetting their medical professionals. And lastly, all these cases, because it seems almost every couple of weeks there's another healthcare fraud case or a medical serial killer case in the newspaper. This has really educated the public and given them a great awareness. So yes, things have improved a lot, but there's still a long way to go.
How do you think has public perception of healthcare crimes changed over the years, if at all?
Well, let's talk a little bit about COVID, okay? So when COVID hit, what was the first thing the hospital said? No family, no visitors, right? Now, if you're so inclined to kill people, wow, isn't that awesome? I don't have to worry about family or visitors taking a look at what I'm doing anymore. Now, I understand the medical reason for that, but when you look at it from the bad person's view, that was really a gift. And also look at it this way. Many hospitals found themselves understaffed. They were desperate for people. It's like you're in the infantry, you're on the front lines, and all of a sudden the enemy's coming over the hill. Do you have time to do a thorough background investigation on every soldier that you're going to put in that front line? Hell no. You're just happy you got a soldier there. Some hospitals found themselves bringing in nurses and doctors from all over the country, traveling nurses and doctors. Many of them were excellent. Some of them were not so excellent. Some of them had troubled past and background. Some of them were there for the sole purpose of diverting drugs.
I'm curious if you think that COVID has played a role perhaps negatively in healthcare organizations' abilities
and right now,
to
as we
vet
speak, there's actually
whoever they're
at
hiring,
least
be it
two
nurses or
medical
doctors.
serial killer cases involving COVID-19 that I'm aware of. One is in Canada, a Dr. Nadler. I invite people to Google that case and read all about it. He allegedly took advantage of COVID-19 to murder patients. I don't know if it's true or not. It's still ongoing. And there's an ongoing case in Germany, almost identical to the Canadian case. So yeah, desperate times call for desperate measures, but it did enable the bad people to get away with things. And hopefully things now have returned more normal. I hope we never see a situation like we saw the last time.
Bruce, when thinking about the general public, what do you think that they can do to protect themselves when they're receiving medical care?
Yeah, you know what? The best thing you could do is don't go it alone. Have somebody with you who's an advocate. And when I say an advocate, I mean a very polite individual who records everything and politely asks questions and makes notes for you and keeps a journal. Because if I'm going to harm somebody, I'm not going to harm somebody that has an advocate like that, writing everything down and asking questions and keeping notes. I'm going to go after the person who's by themselves, who the family rarely, if ever, even comes visit. In my view, nobody's even going to care if the person expires. So really, the best thing you could do is have a very polite and responsible advocate. Not somebody that's a pain in the ass to the nurses or staff, but somebody who very politely and responsibly records everything.
Looking back on your career, what are the most important lessons that you've learned?
Wow. I think the most important lessons that I've learned is to treat our whistleblowers like Fort Knox gold. Now, look, not every whistleblower is of the best intention. Not every whistleblower provides information that's accurate, but we don't know that until we thoroughly investigate it. And it's very, very important that employees feel that they could go to a compliance department or somewhere in the organization, be treated respectfully, and the matter will be handled professionally. If that doesn't happen, it's going to have a very deleterious effect on the organization and all the individuals involved.
I agree. I think that whistleblowers in any capacity, not just related to healthcare related crimes, should be respected and protected because you never know what kind of information they have to offer. It might just solve a crime entirely. Bruce, what are your future plans, and do you have any upcoming projects or investigations that you can share with us?
Well, my future plan is to keep speaking and educating both the medical profession and the law enforcement profession about these cases. I have 2 other books other than the Behind the Murder Curtain that I've been involved with. One book is called The Art of Investigation. It's a collection of stories by investigators. And the second book, which was just released, is called The Art of Investigation Revisited, also a collection of stories by investigators. And there's additional books coming out in the series. So I would say writing, speaking, and educating is what my future holds.
Bruce, outside of your books that you shared with us, where can listeners find more information about you and your work?
Well, I have a website. It's behindthemurdercurtain.com. There's an email address in there where they could reach me. I get a lot of correspondence from people all over the world regarding suspicious medical deaths or other hospital-related crimes. I'm always happy to respond to them as best I can. So if they just go to behindthemurdercurtain.com, the same title as my first book, they'll find all the information they need.
Bruce, thank you so much for taking us behind the scenes of the most disturbing and perplexing healthcare crimes that I have heard of myself. Again, if you want to learn more about Bruce and his work, be sure to check out his book, Behind the Murder Curtain, which is available wherever books are sold. And for those of us who thought that hospitals were sanctuaries of care, this episode is a sobering reminder that there is evil with ill intent everywhere, even in places we least expect. If you liked what you heard today, hit the subscribe button and leave me a 5-star review. If you want bonus content, you can find me on Patreon, fthatpod. You can find me on all social media at fthatpod, except for Instagram, which is fthat_pod. Don't forget to check out the website, which is fthatpod.com.